Today we are going to discuss cities and urban land use. Hope you enjoy. Urbanization is the growth and diffusion of city landscapes and urban lifestyles. Permanent settlements developed over generations of rapid urbanization, which has also led to problems like overcrowding and pollution. In fact, 10 million people die each year because of hazardous conditions due to overcrowding and inadequate infrastructure support in areas experiencing explosive urbanization. There are a few main urban hearth areas where civilizations began. These include Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley, the Nile Valley, the Huanghe River, Mexico, and Peru.
Metropolitan statistical areas, or MSAs, describe a central city and its interacting counties of at least 50,000 people. A micropolitan statistical areas is an area with the same size central city, but an area of surrounding counties of only 10,000 to 50,000 people. A megalopolis, such as Bosnia-Wash, which is the megalopolis formed by Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C., is a massive urban blob of overlapping integrated metropolitan areas whose distinctive boundaries are difficult to find. Fun fact, Tokyo was by far the most populous urban agglomeration in the world, with 35 million residents in 2005.
The economy of a place is another layer in classifying it as a rural or urban. Economically, cities often have more diversity in economic activities, from dog walking and hairstyling to surgery and broadcast journalism. For example, Japan defines a city as a place with at least 50,000 inhabitants, 60% or more of whom are engaged in trade, manufacturing, or other non-agricultural activities. Once ancient humans domesticated animals and began to grow crops, they could produce surpluses of food, leading to permanent settlement and eventually economic diversification, with people performing various jobs rather than just farming. Money developed, records were written, laws were codified, and services were provided. Surrounding farmland grew up to support cities. Traditionally, larger cities have shown a high degree of economic diversity. A cultural layer also plays a role in defining a place's degree of urbanity or cityness. A tourist in Paris can visit the Paris Opera House, tour the Louvre Museum, and see the Mona Lisa, and eat delicious Indian food. Cultural diversity, complexity, and vibrancy also contribute to a geographer's classification of a place as a city. Thus, our search for a clear definition of what makes a city has led us to more of a process of comparison than a sentence or two. Geographers use factors such as the size of the population in a given historical and geographic context, economic diversity, governmental organization, delineated boundaries, and cultural complexity to analyze the degree to which a place is considered urban.
Now we are going to discuss industrialization. Cities have always provided economic functions from their surrounding rural lands. Pre-industrial cities, such as London, served as trade centers and gateways to foreign lands and markets. Internally, pre-industrial cities often had a diverse mix of economic functions in any given space, rather than the specific zoning that came with industrialization. Mercantilism is a system in which European governments controlled economic activity and aimed to gain as many new colonies as possible to increase their nation's wealth and supplies. On to colonial cities, which were cities constructed with the aim of exporting raw resources from the colonial city back to the mother country. Examples of colonial cities include Rio de Janeiro and Santo Domingo. By the beginning of the 1500s, most cities were located in an arch of trade centers that extended from London to Tokyo, a line of cities known as the urban banana because of the crescent or banana-like shape. This is shown on the diagram with this delicious banana extending from London to Tokyo. The urban banana of dominant cities resulted from both site and situation factors. Site factors are the physical and cultural characteristics of a place that help us learn something about the city. Factors like arable land, street layout, and building materials. Situation factors relate to how a city fits into a larger urban network, such as proximity to major trade routes and other urban places.
Industrialization and city structure. In 1800, only 5% of the world's population lived in cities. By 1950, 16% lived in cities. By 2000, nearly 50% of the world's population lived in cities. What caused this explosion in urbanization? Largely, the diffusion of industrialization is responsible for urbanizing the world's people, albeit at unequal levels. More than 75% of the world's population living in more developed countries is considered urban. However, only about 40% of the world's population living in less developed countries is considered urban. Specifically, Africa and Asia are the least urbanized continents on the earth, while North America is the most urbanized continent, with nearly 80% of its people living in urban places. In 2001, only 35% of the African population was considered urban. Shock cities are urban places experiencing infrastructural challenges related to massive urbanization. Accompanying rapid rates of urbanizations are challenging social, economic, and cultural changes, such as the growth of slums, hazardous pollution levels, deadly fires, the growth of urban prostitution, and the exploitation of children. Examples of shock cities were Manchester and Chicago. By the early 1900s, most of the world's greatest cities were American and European industrial cities, like Manchester, Chicago, and Barcelona. The industrial city had a different function from its pre-industrial precursor. Rather than serving mainly as an administrative, religious, trade, or gateway city, the industrial city's primary function was to make and distribute manufactured products.
Models of city structure. All urban places are part of an interlocking urban system of cities that operate within a network of spatial interaction. In other words, urban places are interdependent, not independent, and exist in a spiderweb of interacting parts. Geographers analyze the spatial distribution of cities, trying to determine why the spiderweb looks like it does. The first model we're going to look at is Christoller's central place model. Opposite of Van Thunen's model that explained rural land use, Christoller's model explains urban land use. Just like most models, Christoller created his model in an isolated state, or ideal world, with assumptions of a flat land surface, a uniformly distributed rural population, equal transportation methods spread throughout the space, and an evolutionary movement toward the growth of cities. Christoller used four main ideas in his model. Central places are urban centers that provide services to their surrounding rural people. Collectively referred to as the central places hinterland, the threshold is the minimum number of people needed to fuel a particular function's existence in a central place. The more unique and special an economic function, the higher its threshold. The range of a good or service is the maximum distance a person is willing to travel to obtain that good or service. Spatial competition implies that central places compete with each other for customers. Central places contain economic functions with high thresholds and high ranges that require large populations to serve groups of smaller central places existing around them, whereas Van Thunen's model resulted in concentric rings of rural land use. Christoller's model predicted a hexagonal pattern of urban central places. In this pattern, smaller central places will be located closer together, because consumers will not be willing to travel far for lower central place functions, like gas stations and donut shops. Donuts. However, larger central places will be located farther away from each other because consumers are more willing to travel a longer distance to obtain higher central place functions, like brain surgery. Essentially, the central place theory predicts that if a population is evenly distributed, there will be a hierarchy of evenly spread central places to serve that population. Such an urban hierarchy is a system of cities consisting of various levels, with only a few cities at the highest level and increasingly more settlements on each lower level. Now we're going to move on to the rank size rule. The rank size rule states that the nth largest city's population size in a region is 1/nth the size of the region's largest city's population. So, for example, the fourth largest city in a nation is going to be 1/4 the size of the biggest city in that area. Now, this also, along with Christoller's central place theory, is for an ideal model, so it doesn't really work out in places a lot, but it does work out some places. While the urban hierarchy in the United States urban system roughly conforms to the rank-size rule prediction, some urban systems have disproportionately large cities known as primate cities. Cities with such primacy, such as Buenos Aires, London, Paris, and Rio de Janeiro, are often much larger than the second largest city in the country's urban hierarchy. Primate cities essentially dominate a country's economic, political, and cultural functions, and demonstrate a high degree of centrality. Moving on to world cities and megacities. World cities are powerful cities that control a disproportionately high level of the world's economic, political, and cultural activities. Examples of world cities, also called global cities, include New York, London, Lisbon, Amsterdam, Rome, Paris, Berlin, Chicago, and St. Petersburg. Today's world cities are less concerned with serving as administrative centers of power over imperialism and trade. Instead, modern cities are centers of global financial decisions, flows of information, and multinational or transitional corporations driving the global economic and political landscape. Another term related to being a world city is pan-regional influence. New York City is a world city with pan-regional influence, meaning its range extends beyond North America into the other two centers of economic control, Europe, Africa, Middle East, and Asia, Oceania. Home to powerful media outlets, financial institutions, global corporate headquarters, and political organizations like the United Nations, New York City is a world city because it influences a larger percent of world affairs than its share of the world's population would suggest. In other words, New York City is a world city because its global influence is larger than its share of the Earth's population. Also, a city can be considered a world city when it dominates a distinct area of global affairs. For instance, Amsterdam is a global financial center, and Milan exerts powerful influence over fashion and design. Megacities are not considered world cities, but they do have a high degree of centrality and primacy, thereby exerting high levels of influence and power in their country's economies. All megacities are large, having more than 10 million inhabitants. Examples of megacities include Beijing, Cairo, Mexico City, and Jakarta.
There is an important distinction between level and rate of urbanization. Rate of urbanization is the speed at which the population is becoming urban, while level of urbanization is the percentage of people already considered urban. For example, the level of urbanization in the U.S. is nearly 75%, meaning that nearly 75% of the U.S. population lives in urban places. However, the rate of urbanization in the U.S. is much lower than the rate of urbanization, for example, in China, which is experiencing a rapid rate of urbanization despite its lower level of urbanization, which is nearly 30%. An important trend in modern urbanization is its diffusion to less developed parts of the world and its uneven spread. Overall, the highest rates of urbanization are occurring in places with the lowest levels of urbanization, in less developed peripheral countries. In 1950, nearly 60% of urbanized places were in more developed countries. By 1980, 19 of the largest 30 metropolitan areas in the world were in the less developed world, indicating a clear surge in the growth of urban cities in less developed countries. Although rates of urbanization in core countries are relatively low, their levels of urbanization are already high. The populations of most core countries are already above 75% urban. In semi-peripheral countries, rates of urbanization are also high. Cities in more developed countries are fading from the list of the world's largest cities. As we have seen, urbanization in less developed countries is often focused on one or two major cities with a high degree of primacy and centrality, rather than being spread evenly throughout the country's landscape. Such intensely high rates of urbanization in less developed countries are straining the infrastructures of the growing cities. Their growth has happened so quickly that these cities are often referred to as shock cities. Large migration streams of young adults moving from rural areas to urban areas in pursuit of job opportunities challenge already strained urban places. These young rural-urban migrants are often depressed to find filthy living conditions and demeaning working conditions. Unable to find housing, many new migrants build squatter settlements, makeshift, unsafe housing constructed from any scraps they can find on land they neither rent nor own. The 1996 United Nations Conference on Human Settlements estimated that 600 million people were living in unsafe and life-threatening conditions in cities. Further, as much as 33% of the world's urban households live in absolute poverty. Models of urban systems. In the 1960s, Samuel Borchert studied U.S. cities and linked historical changes to urban evolution. Borchert's model of urban evolution defined four categories of cities based on the transportation technology that dominated during the era when the city hit its initial growth spurt and found a comparative advantage in the economy. In stage one of this model are cities that first grew during the sail wagon era of 1790 to 1830, most near ports and waterways for transportation. In stage two, iron horse cities were born and grew around rivers and canals during the early industrial years of 1830 to 1870, when the railroad and steamboats were rapidly spreading. By stage three, the steel rail epoch of 1870 through 1920, the Industrial Revolution was at full steam in the U.S. Powered by the steel industry, industrial cities blossomed, particularly around the Great Lakes. Stage 4 cities were born around 1920 and were intricately linked to the car and air travel, leading to a maze of road networks and the rapid spread of suburbs. Stage 4 saw the growth of new, more influential cities in the South. Cultural and regional urban diversity. Differences among cities often result from their cultural and national context. Monuments, temples, and pyramids dominate ancient Chinese and Mexican cityscapes to show the dominance of their government and religious philosophies, as well as to provide studying for important functions. In contrast, medieval Islamic cities were organized with tiny, winding, dead-end streets into which mosques and government buildings were woven and not prominently displayed. Medieval Muslims believed their buildings should blend into the urban landscape, usually to ensure privacy and protection from outsiders. Visiting Europeans often described such Islamic cities as mysterious, showing how different the Europeans' outlook on urban structure was from the Muslim view. Although two cities may have similar sizes, economic functions, and standards of living, like Chicago and New York, they can vary in their spatial layout and unique sense of place. Even as cities become more interconnected with globalization and even as people travel and communicate more frequently among the world's urban places, cities still show the imprints of the generations of people and economic functions that have influenced their growth. Although two cities may have similar sizes, economic functions, and standards of living, like Chicago and New York, they can vary in their spatial layout and unique sense of place. Even as cities become more interconnected with globalization and even as people travel and communicate more frequently among the world's urban places, cities can still show the imprints of the generations of people and economic functions that have influenced their growth. Just as the rings within old trees reflect layers of growth, city landscapes reflect the periods of their greatest development. Even the relatively young cities of the U.S., compared with ancient cities like Rome, vary significantly depending on their historical eras of growth, their growth spurt phases, if you will.